Hello and good morning. Welcome to the second day of the 2020 Uplift Convergence. My name is Mariela and I am joined by Uplift Fellow and comrade Alicia. I will let them introduce themselves as well as the workshop. We are going to start right now and yeah, I'm just extremely grateful and thankful for every single one of you who is here alongside Alicia and who is here watching this workshop. Gracias.
All right. Kuwatsi, Mera Hopa, Alicia Cris, Medicana Ese, Kiwa Mesata. Good morning, everyone. My name is Alicia Cris. Oh goodness, I'm seeing all the captions of my language. But I'm from the Pueblo, Santo Domingo, and I'm also a member of the Pueblo Feminist Caucus of the Red Nation. And so it brings me great pleasure to introduce our panel today, which is on Pueblo, Puebla, Pueblex, Feminism, and Nuclear Colonialism. Let's see. And so I'll be introducing some of our panelists today. So first up, we have Jennifer Marley. Jennifer Marley is a PhD student in the American Studies Department at the University of New Mexico. Jennifer entered the program having completed a BA with a double major in Native American Studies and American Studies from the University of New Mexico back in 2019. Jennifer's research interests include queer Indigenous studies, Indigenous feminisms, third world feminisms, Indigenous political movements, Marxism, internationalism, environmental studies, critical Indigenous studies, and settler colonialism. Influenced by her upbringing as a citizen of San Ildefonso Pueblo, Jennifer's research explores the unique ways heteropatriarchy has manifested in Pueblo communities and how this shapes and reshapes Pueblo identity and kinship, as well as relationships to the state, other groups, and other groups. In particular, Jennifer is interested in articulating a Pueblo, Puebla, Pueblex feminist lens and contributing to the theoretical frameworks Indigenous feminisms have produced. And let me see. And so then I'll also be introducing another comrade of mine, Justine Tiba. She goes by she and they pronouns. She's from the Pueblos of Santa Clara, Tesuque, and Acoma. She is a co-founder of the Pueblo, Puebla, Pueblex Feminist Caucus of the Red Nation and is also a member of the Red Nation Albuquerque Freedom Council. And let me see, and then our third panelist is Melody Meyer. Melody Meyer is a legal fellow at the Yurok Tribe Office of the Tribal Eternity. She graduated from law in 2020, specializations in environmental law and critical race studies. Melody has a bachelor's degree from the University of New Mexico in Native American Studies, and she is a citizen of the Pueblo of Laguna. So thank you all for joining us. A major shout out to our Pueblo femmes on this call, and we can go ahead and get started. And let me pull up those links. Okay. Okay, can everyone see that here? Okay. All right, so whenever you guys are ready.
Yeah, so we're going to do a brief introduction on our Pueblo Feminist Caucus manifesto. So we're actually just going to read through it real quick, and then we'll get on to each of our panels. So the Pueblo Feminist Caucus is an official...
Sorry. Let's start at the purpose of PFC, just for the sake of time.
The Pueblo Feminist Caucus serves as a political caucus within the Red Nation. We operate in accordance with the Red Nation's principles of unity and Pueblo cultural values. Our purpose is to create a movement that specifically addresses the distinct ways heteropatriarchy, colonialism, individualism, capitalism, racism, ableism, and weaponized religion have manifested in Pueblo communities. We do this through organizing that includes historical research and analysis, community education, and mobilizing direct action and advocacy. All of the institutions named are those who wish to seek and eliminate us completely, so we call for their abolition. While Pueblo, Puebla, Pueblex feminism is unique in having resulted from specific political, cultural, and religious structures imposed by the colonization and occupation by Spanish, Mexican, and US governments, the Pueblo Feminist Caucus movement the Pueblo feminist movement is also realized as belonging and aligning with traditions of indigenous feminisms, women of color feminisms, Black feminist traditions, Marxist feminism, third world feminism, and indigenista theory. We understand the politics of this caucus as rooted in the revolutionary feminist traditions that have long served colonized peoples. We seek to build broad struggle among all colonized people, but center Pueblo people in acknowledgement that the misogynistic violence stemming from a distortion of history leads our communities to adopt the institutions of heteropatriarchy, capitalism, and weaponized religion as traditional. We create this creates particularly hostile conditions for Pueblo femmes, LGBTQ2+, and gender nonconforming people. We aim to organize and educate all those seeking freedom from the violence of heteropatriarchy, capitalism, settler colonialism, and white supremacy, etc., and strive toward truly honoring Pueblo governance structures by restoring balance of power among all genders that enables collaborative and cooperative development of a life-affirming world for ourselves and for all our relations of the earth. We look beyond the constraints of neoliberalism and instead look towards the pre-colonial structures of governance and economics that fundamentally oppose capitalism in all manifestations. We work in this caucus to dismantle toxic systems and build power, infrastructure, and community, and turn back the tides of destruction that diminish our sacred way of life as Pueblo people.
Can you scroll down to the 6 points, please? Okay, so within this manifesto, we include our 6-point program. So I'll start with the first one, and that's we call for the end of heteropatriarchal violence. European settlement depended on the dissolving of indigenous governance structures to assert authority. And for this reason, violence upon queer and feminine bodies was used as a primary tactic for the obliteration of indigenous governance structures. Because indigenous bodies stand in the way of access to the land, and because women are seen as the producers of native nations through the European heteropatriarchal lens, violence against women, particularly sexual violence, is used as a means of separating native people from their land. Women and queer individuals, especially when in positions of power, become the biggest threat to settler projects of dispossession. Sexual violence is such an effective tool of conquest because of the overwhelming damage it inflicts upon families, lasting for generations and instilling shame and humiliation that discourages any efforts to resist. We demand an end to the perpetuation of sexist, transphobic, and homophobic violence and machismo culture within our communities. We demand safety and respect for all Pueblo AX women and LGBTQ2S individuals. We demand an end to all sexual abuse, physical abuse, spiritual abuse, and psychological abuse enacted upon all Pueblo people.
Point 2, the end of excommunication and disenrollment on the basis of blood quantum. The infamous Indian killer Andrew Jackson suggested that the intermarriage between white settlers and Native women would result in the assimilation of Native peoples and thus the assimilation of the Native lands into the United States. The idea that whiteness could somehow overpower or dilute indigeneity on a biological level is what led to the creation of the blood quantum system, a system also crafted to place indigenous people on an inevitable trajectory towards total disappearance. With the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934, blood quantum laws were applied to all Native nations and had to be met in order to maintain federal recognition. This required that all citizens of the Native nation meet the blood quantum criteria of at least 1/4 Indian blood. We know that our tribes depend on maintaining blood quantum to continue receiving federal benefits that are vital. However, continued participation in the eradication of our own nations will never be beneficial to our continuance as Pueblo people. Historically, practices such as the naming of infants and various rites marking coming of age determined belonging and citizenship for Native people. For Pueblo people specifically, matrilineal kinship structures determined affiliation. We demand an end to self-elimination via excommunication and disenrollment of Pueblo people on the basis of blood quantum. Blood quantum is contradictory to Pueblo notions of kinship, clanship, belonging, and identity that are traditionally situated by matrilineality. We have long shared lineage with surrounding tribes prior to colonization. This did not diminish our ties to our nations. Ultimately, cultural participation and contributions to our families and community affirm belonging.
Point 3, we demand an end to the weaponization of religion and toxic traditionalism. Critiques of traditionalism have already been articulated by Indigenous feminists. We are using the term toxic traditionalism to specifically describe stagnant values that have been woven into our culture as a result of colonialism and deliberate colonial tactics used to obstruct our way of life in order for us to submit to settler occupiers. We often keep those traditions simply because they have become traditions, not because they serve us and our core values. We also look at toxic traditionalism as the distortion and weaponization of tradition and how we use those tactics on ourselves. We emphasize that toxic traditionalism does not apply to all traditions or the sacred and ceremonial. The normalization of sexist violence is often conflated with tradition and even accepted as unchangeable or even on par with Pueblo core values. The PFC seeks to provide counter narratives to the normalization of sexist violence, citing the same core values and oral histories that are wielded against marginalized Pueblo people. Toxic traditionalism further erases women, LGBTQ2, and our gender nonconforming relatives by keeping them in submissive positions within our communities and prioritizing the voices and opinions of only cisgender heterosexual men. Toxic traditionalism aims to silence any opinions or views that are contradictory to it. Through toxic traditionalism and the weaponization of religion, some individuals in positions of power abuse certain aspects of traditional and sacred knowledge by keeping it to themselves and shaming those who don't or haven't had access to the same knowledge simply because they don't fit the cisgender or heterosexual male identity. This keeps an oppressive power imbalance in place. We demand an end to the use of toxic traditionalism and weaponized religion. We demand that voices of our women, LGBTQ2, and gender nonconforming relatives be heard and their liberation be at the forefront of our liberation as Native peoples.
So 4, the end of the exploitation of Pueblo culture and sacred knowledge and objects. For generations, Pueblo people have been dependent upon the Indian art industry and tourism industry for basic income. Though the art and culture of Pueblo people should continue to be celebrated, these industries are notorious for their exploitative practices, from the theft of sacred objects to the divulging of sacred knowledge and the mistreatment of Native artisans. These industries profit off our labor while commodifying our culture, yet Pueblo people suffer from the worst rates of poverty, while the white elite who consume Native art, control these industries, live in luxury on Pueblo lands. We demand an end to the exploitation of Pueblo culture, people, and sacred objects. We demand that sacred items and objects be repatriated and that Native artists, laborers no longer be exploited.
Point 5, we demand an end to glorification of the genocide of Pueblo people. Pueblo people are constantly reminded of their genocide through revisionist history, colonial imagery, and celebrations that glorify our conquest by the Spanish crown and the US empire. We have continually resisted the erasure of Pueblo's resistance to conquest and fought to have our history accurately taught in educational institutions. Presently, statutes of Spanish and US colonizers are proudly displayed. Our lands and sacred sites still bear names paying homage to the conquest, and educational texts at all levels of schooling remain inaccurate, incomplete, or blatantly revised. These are not simply symbolistic issues, nor issues of representation. They reflect very real ongoing climate of violence against Indigenous people. We demand that all racist imagery and celebrations of conquest and colonization be abolished. We demand an end to all narratives ignoring the ongoing violence against Pueblo's people in all its forms. We call for the installation of an accurate Pueblo-driven curriculum to replace the revisionist history curriculum at all levels of public and private educational institutions. We demand that Pueblo students have access to cultural curriculum and language classes.
Endpoint 6, we demand an end to land loss and at the hands of corporate and settler interests. Popular tourist sites such as Ojo Caliente Hot Springs and the city of Los Alamos sit atop some of the most sacred locations to Tewa people. Likewise, the development of resorts and campsites in the Jemez and Santa Fe Mountains serve a primarily white upper class base. Not only do popular tourism sites disrupt our relationship to the land by decreasing ancestral hunting and gathering grounds, the communities that are most impacted seldom see significant revenue from these tourist attractions. Los Alamos National Labs and the presence of the Jackpile uranium mine in Laguna Pueblo are some of the first sites of the nuclear industrial complex and continue the project of militarization of Pueblo lands. Los Alamos is not only a tourist site, it is first and foremost a site of military occupation and continues to exist as such. It is such a disturbing irony that among the most holiest places of the Tewa world, the most deadliest weapon in all of human history was created. The devastation of the nuclear bomb began not in Japan, but right here in New Mexico, with Pueblo people as their first victims who still suffer the long-term health impacts of exposure to radioactivity. We demand an end to all projects of resource extraction, militarism, corporate plunder, and settler interests on Pueblo lands.
So that's our manifesto. This was written over the course of several months. It had input from everyone from youth to elders to just community members, and it's also a living document. So it's something that we don't think should be necessarily static. It's something that should be fluid and changing as our material conditions change. Yeah, so I just wanted to put that out there. And, hopefully someday having a caucus for the, explicit purpose of confronting heteropatriarchy won't be necessary, right? But for the time being, it certainly is. And so we chose to talk about nuclear colonialism in this panel because it's something our members have expertise on, but more broadly, we want to talk about the environmental impacts that Pueblo people face due to projects of militarization and colonialism on our land, but also how toxic traditionalism manifests in these conversations.
Yeah, so I'll be talking I'll be going a little bit more into toxic traditionalism, and I'll start by going over like what toxic traditionalism actually means. So toxic traditionalism is basically the adoption of what are usually colonial imposed values woven into our traditional pre-colonial values. So that's how we have, for example, that's how we have like an installation of a heteropatriarchy. Pueblo people were once matrilineal societies. However, with the process of colonization, when the patriarchs came, they left patriarchs behind them. And so we have a clear example of we have clear examples here in Pueblo communities of when our pre-colonial leadership structures were uprooted, which were, and because they were inclusive of women and LGBTQ, relatives and leaders, that is the reason they were uprooted, because they did not serve a patriarchy. And so therefore a patriarchy was installed. And we have clear examples of this. The foreign patriarchies chose which leaders that they would talk to, none of which was inclusive of women and LGBTQ. That's when we got the canes, right? And so toxic traditionalism is also used. Sorry, back up. So the installation of a heteropatriarchy, while we honor it, traditionally, it's actually not a pre-colonial, Pueblo core value that that serves us. And so through that, the toxic traditionalism has a broader definition of these colonial imposed values affecting our way of life. And so one way toxic traditionalism is one way that toxic traditionalism is used in Pueblo communities is it actually is used as a tool to sort of hinder our ability to assess our material conditions. And so what I mean by that is when we want to talk about, when we want to talk about things like, radioactivity and nuclear colonialism and nuclear waste and stuff like that, it is often, it's often confronted with like, well, if you believe in those things, then then it's gonna be real, basically. And so it's sort of like used as like it's a way of using tradition of not talking about certain things as a way to gaslight people into straight up not believing that they exist. And so in Pueblo communities, toxic traditionalism doesn't serve us, because these we have like we say in the PFC manifesto, that nuclear colonialism began in Tewa lands. It began in the Los Alamos National Labs, which is one of the most holiest sites in the Tewa world. And that's actually that the Los Alamos National Labs directly impacts not only Jen's community of San Ildefonso, but also my community too of Santa Clara. And, we have, it affects our ability to even be, to even have like sovereignty, like to even live sustainably, so we have the Los Alamos National Labs that releases vapors into Tewa airspace. I know they've done this as recently as a couple months ago, and it's contaminated our watershed. And so even if we want to do things like grow our own vegetables or even live off the land and hunt our own food, we can't, because they're all contaminated with nuclear radiation and waste. And we could even go a step further into that. We can't even, culturally, we have radioactivity that contaminates our own like lifeways and livelihoods. The clay that we use for our pots in ceremony, those are contaminated. The animals and furs that we use in ceremony, those are contaminated. The water that we use is contaminated. Even the evergreens that we dance with are contaminated. But those are things that we never talk about because of being shoved into silence or gaslit from believing those sort of things. And so I believe that one of the things that we need to, I guess, encounter as Pueblo people too, is also having that conversation within our own communities of actually having to talk about these things, and sort of holding these and also, that's going to be the conversation that's going to start us being able to hold the settler governments accountable for these atrocities, which Jen and Melody have a lot more to say about than I do. So I'll be passing it on. Thank you.
Okay, give me a second. I'll pull up your slides.
Okay. Thank you, Justine. Yeah, so the presentation what I'll just be talking about today stems from a paper that I wrote, and it mainly focuses on the Jackpile uranium mine, which was also mentioned in the manifesto, which is on my home in Laguna, Pueblo, which is about an hour west of Albuquerque. And there are 4 parts to the research that I did. One is looking at the details of the mine and the different effects that it has on both the people and the land. The second part is looking at nuclear energy and how that's sort of been pushed in some circles as a sort of solution to climate crisis, and looking at American eco-nationalism, which I'll talk about, and finally, just some proposed solutions towards helping these communities move forward from the contamination, and also looking to have a climate change solution that benefits all people and doesn't disproportionately affect the Pueblos and the indigenous peoples in New Mexico. So for the mine, the research that I did was important for me because a lot of, as you'll see, like with a lot of these nuclear effects in the Pueblos and on Navajo Nation, research rarely is done by the government, or the tribes don't have as many resources as they need to have research on what are the effects, especially doing health effects, because that tends to be very expensive and takes a long time to get a lot of that data together. And so I think it's important to focus on these effects because, and then a lot of people assume that they're mainly just health-based or land-based, but as Justine talked about, it affects the cultural health and well-being of the tribes as well, because it affects, we have so many of these things that we use in our ceremonies and in just our daily cultural lives. And so the mine itself was started by the Cold War arms race. The US wanted to have more uranium stockpiled, and it operated on Laguna's reservation from 1952 to 1982. And it was mainly, the people who were employed by the mine were mainly Laguna Pueblo peoples, but there were also indigenous peoples from other areas within around Laguna as well. And in 2013, it was designated as a Superfund site under the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act, which is basically just a federal statute that seeks to clean up these really environmentally contaminated lands. And again, the effects are largely unknown on the people. We're still, Laguna's still doing a lot of data collecting, and the studies are ongoing, especially since radon and radioactive contamination can take like hundreds of years to manifest. So, but mainly the primary concerns for our tribe have been high rates of cancer and also water contamination as well. You can go ahead and go to the next slide, Elisa. And so the disparate effects of the mine involve that we see for indigenous peoples often are, you know, the federal government will propose a solution such as, well, why don't we just relocate this community away from the contamination? For indigenous peoples, that's not a good option because for a lot of the Pueblos, where we're currently located on the reservation is our ancestral homelands. That's where we believe we were created and came from. So it's never going to be an option to relocate. Also, a lot of the solutions are aimed at providing economic relief, which is either providing a large settlement for people to be able to pay for their medical expenses, or providing some sort of stimulus in the community to sort of replicate that employment that the mine provided for them. However, this just still doesn't address a lot of the other harms that we've already talked about, including the harms to the culture and just some of the other harms that I sort of touched on and didn't really think about before were how much it changed the way that people make a living for themselves. So Laguna used to be primarily agricultural in providing for their families, and also there was a lot of ranching. However, when the mine came in, a lot of people switched to being more dependent on like a 9-to-5 job, and they started gaining a lot of more expenses that required more income. And that when the mine closed down, that led to a lot of people losing their jobs, and then that sort of made issues such as drug abuse and alcohol abuse worse as well. So it's brought on a lot of effects that can't be really solved with just like an economic sort of stimulus or sort of relocation or anything like that. So you can go ahead and skip a couple slides ahead, Alicia. And then, so for the area that I focus on, climate change, nuclear energy has been identified as like one potential source that could help reduce CO2 emissions. It's a part of a lot of models for GHG reduction. It's relatively low carbon, but it's still really expensive, which is something that makes it a little bit less likely than some of the other renewable energy sources. But it's still a major possibility, and it has still remains something that people talk about. And the arguments that are always raised against nuclear energy tend to be the possibility of some sort of meltdown within the actual production of the energy. They talk about Chernobyl or Fukushima, but I've rarely seen arguments in the more popular conscious talking about the harmful effects of mining. And that's always something that people leave out because it usually involves people of color and indigenous peoples who are providing that labor for the uranium. And the thing is that the technology or the safety of the mining hasn't improved as vastly as nuclear technology itself has. So it still requires that manual labor and close contact with uranium. And of course, the environmental impacts of mining are still the same. So moving to sort of look at this in the larger context of settler and extractive colonialism and environmental racism, these are what have allowed the non-consensual extraction of these resources on indigenous lands. And American eco-nationalism is a term that I sort of used in my paper based on various sources that describes the desire of the United States to end its reliance on foreign energy sources and instead promote green energy sources that can be maintained within the US boundaries while appropriating indigenous landscapes and resources. So the nationalism aspect comes from white American interests being centered to the detriment of indigenous populations. We saw this with the Cold War and uranium mining, and the extreme fears of a possible nuclear arms race, or the fears from the arms race led to these extreme actions of depleting uranium in these really large amounts. And then this sort of view of ending reliance on foreign sources appeals to working classes as well, because there's this huge concern over the loss of the energy industry. And then finally, eco-nationalism is what I wanted to bring out, in that climate change mitigations may end up harming indigenous peoples in some ways as well. We know that climate change is going to affect indigenous peoples really significantly, but if we're not careful with how we address it, it could end up harming indigenous peoples as well. And so that's where I'll end my sort of presentation, but happy to answer any questions as well. So I'll just go ahead and hand it off to Jen, but thank you.
Thank you so much, Melody. Um, so yeah, I'm sorry if I sound a little bit repetitive. Everyone's just been dropping such amazing knowledge. But I'm going to talk a little more specifically about Los Alamos National Labs for my portion, and just kind of critiquing the culture built around nuclearism, and how it's really glamorized New Mexico as a part of the tourism industry. Um, so So, as Justine mentioned, the origin of the global nuclear arms and energy industry was concealed within stolen San Ildefonso Pueblo territory. That is where Los Alamos National Labs was built, the first major nuclear research facility in the US, and the creation place of the nuclear bomb. And although the space that Lionel currently occupies is what's considered San Ildefonso territory, the mountains hold cultural significance to all Tewa people, as well as the people of Jemez Pueblo and Cochiti Pueblo. Um, so after a pitiful amount of money was offered to the Pueblo of San Ildefonso by the U.S. government, tribal leader refused to sell the sacred area, saying a price could not be put on that land. And soon after leadership had made their disdain very clear for the placement of Lionel, the facility was quickly constructed. They took it anyway. Yet the creation home of the world's deadliest weapon lies amidst a place of immense sacredness, again, to not just San Ildefonso people, but all Taylor people. We consider it an emergent place of all Taylor people, and it resides in one of our sacred mountain ranges. Um, so, as But again, this struggle is not just a Pueblo struggle. It connects us to all indigenous people and colonized people impacted by nuclearism. As early as 1917, Diné people reported the presence of white miners on their land seeking uranium ore that was sent overseas for radium extraction. Widespread industrial open uranium mines opened in 1944 on the Navajo Nation, with uranium now in high demand for the construction of nuclear arms. Over 500 uranium mines were left abandoned on the Navajo Nation alone, not including the hundreds and hundreds of other mines left on native land throughout the U.S. This continuously increases the toxicity of the land and water. And so I'm interested in analyzing how the implications of the presence of the nuclear industry on native land in New Mexico has shaped the way native life and land is seen and valued both locally and globally. And I argue that New Mexico has actually created a hub for the glamorization of nuclear development, which in turn simultaneously fabricates attributes of Native identity and existence that even Native people themselves take up. And so I want to look at the way nuclear development is branded as progress and how it has been melded with celebrations of culture to make to be this like novel and celebratory thing. And then I want to look at the actual environmental degradation that has occurred of nuclear contamination, economic exploitation, and settler infringement. I also I also just want to mention before I forget, because Melody reminded me, but yeah, we hear about Chernobyl and Fukushima a lot, and really I think the narratives built around them that we see in the U.S. are only to further U.S. imperialist narratives and anti-socialist narratives, honestly, because I don't know who's heard of the Church Rock uranium tailings spill, but that spill was said to have been at least as toxic and at least as bad as Chernobyl. And there's really no way of determining if it was worse because Chernobyl is kind of like the standard for like as bad as it can be. But of course, no one knows about that and no one talks about that because it was just a bunch of Indians occupying the land. And as far as US narratives go, it was unoccupied, right? Which of course is a lie. Like Terra Nullius is a lie. So anyways, um, these messages that are fabricated around nuclearism in New Mexico um, put the bomb in a position of sanctity on par with the holy lifeways of Taylor people, which is just this disturbing thing that I'm kind of only now as an adult realizing has always existed. the kinds of moves that celebrate Native culture in tandem, or the kind of moves that celebrate Native culture in tandem with that which actively kills Indigenous people and other racialized populations is not new. They have been selling points in New Mexico tourist industry for generations. Since the inception of the Manhattan Project in 1939 and its success in creating the world's first atomic weapons, Tewa villages have been implicated in New Mexico's nuclear chain as sacrifice zones. And when I say sacrifice zones, I'm referring to the way the U.S. designates certain areas as areas that will forever be uninhabitable. And in PFC and in the Red Nation, we say New Mexico is a sacrifice zone because New Mexico is one of the only places that nearly every single part of the nuclear weapons production chain exists within the state alone. So typically, when you're building nuclear weapons, you have to export products to be, built in one place and then like continue to be built in another. But in New Mexico, that supply chain exists all in New Mexico, which actually makes it so that if New Mexico were to secede as a sovereign nation, it would automatically be the world's strongest nuclear superpower. That's always a disturbing fact that gets me. The establishment of Pueblo at the center of Tewa farmlands, ancestral sites, critical hunting grounds, and gathering grounds forever altered Tewa lifeways. In the years since the reckless dumping and production habits of Llano's research, they've introduced deadly toxins and radiation into the land, water, air, and wildlife. Tewa communities face cumulative and multiple exposures over long periods of time. For communities who lead land-based lifeways that depend on cultural and natural resources for sustenance, exposure to these toxins is catastrophic. And I actually, as I've been learning about the impacts of nuclear exposure, there's so little research done on it because it has only existed for such a short amount of time that because it's something that damages your DNA, there's impacts that might only be able to be observed generations from now. So we don't actually even know the full impacts of radiation exposure like this. Despite this, Tewa people have never been consulted or considered by Llano in addressing the fatal impacts that nuclear research and weapons manufacturing have on Tewa lands and lives, not only now, but for thousands of years. Again, since it's impossible to ever truly clean up nuclear waste, nuclear or radioactive molecules, uranium, they have a half-life of millions of years. So it will be possible to actually clean up nuclear waste in the lifetime of humans on this earth, most likely. Because of this, current protections and remediation efforts that exist are simply superficial. Federal radiation exposure standards do not serve to protect families who engage in land-based lifeways, since those standards are calibrated with the reference man model, a set of physical and lifestyle attributes based off the average Manhattan Project worker that determine safe levels. So reference man was created a really long time ago. Reference man was meant to create to determine safe levels of exposure to workers, cleanup standards, and environmental releases. And the use of this reference man and radiation does calculations that are discriminatory against communities of color and severely underestimates doses to children and women in particular. And this underestimation of dose results is a miscalculation of cancer risk. If a woman, a child, and reference man are standing in a line, reference man will be least at risk. In areas surrounding nuclear weapons, indigenous families are at a constant extreme risk, especially with the consideration of studies that determine low-level exposure to ionizing radiation. This causes as much damage as high-level exposure. The cell response to ionizing radioactive exposure is repair, death, or damage. And rapidly dividing cells are more likely to suffer damage or die before repairing themselves, which puts developing fetuses and children at an elevated risk of suffering defects, damage, or death from exposure at any level, as well as an increased chance of harm to the digestive system, bones, immune system of people of all ages. In the early 1990s, a report conducted by the U.S. Department of Energy identified over 2,100 waste dump sites surrounding Llano. So again, 2,100, 2100 surrounding Llano alone, which were revealed to be emitting harmful toxins. These toxins are known to cause cancer, damage to human anatomy, particularly immune system, reproductive systems, the thyroid, liver, and stomach. Llano's protocol for monitoring groundwater pollution has been identified by the National Academy of Sciences in 2007 report is unable to provide adequate data on the status of toxic pollution. This report also found that Llano is unable to identify the migration of contamination at an early stage due to the complexity of the watershed pathways that intersect with dump sites and the production locations. This same report also found that Llano's current program is compromised in their ability to produce water samples that are representative of ambient groundwater for the purposes of monitoring. And so in my community, what we're fighting from Llano right now is the chromium plume that has been created as a result of waste. And so this plume sits at the top of our watershed, which goes downhill down the Pajarito Plateau, and this is what provides water to Santa Clara, San Ildefonso, Espanola. And so what's happening is the people at Llano claim that, oh no, this plume is not on your land because it stops right before the border. Unfortunately, that's not how science or physics works when it's moving downhill. So they refuse to clean this chromium plume because they claim it's not technically on our land, completely disregarding the movement of water in aquifers. Intergenerational exposure to these toxins is creating a legacy of unnamed sickness on Taylor land, a non-consensual surrender of ecological wellness and community health to the nuclear activities on the hill, a non-consensual surrender to existing as a sacrificed people dwelling in a sacrificed zone. The onset of nuclear colonialism began in some of the most sacred parts of the Taylor world, as we've reiterated again and again. Over 18,000 acres of Pueblo lands were lost in U.S. courts at the start of the Manhattan Project, which signifies the transition into what scholar Joseph P. Moscow calls the plutonium economy. The emergent plutonium economy rendered Taylor communities unable to sustain basic needs due to loss of farmland and traditional hunting and gathering access. The new plutonium economy extended throughout the entire Southwest, prompting other Pueblos and the Navajo Nation and surrounding Hispanic communities to sacrifice land and labor needed by Llano for continued nuclear production. Following this shift in material conditions, the participation in capitalist economic and social modes became framed as a step towards stability for Pueblo individuals and tribal governments. The result is that indigenous people throughout the region were forced to relinquish their economic independence, one of the pillars of political self-determination for Native people, by becoming dependent on the goods produced by nearby border towns. So basically, the Manhattan Project only was able to exist by stealing Native land and forcing Native people to become dependent on Llano, the so-called plutonium economy, forced estimates. And that's why so many laborers from the Pueblos in the Espanola Valley got jobs at Llano and continue to have these jobs because it was a forced dynamic. The Manhattan Project served not only as a tool for economic assimilation, but also a tool for cultural assimilation. The settlements comprised of mostly scientists and engineers that formed in the Pajarito Plateau took interest in the culture of Tewa communities. As a tribute to Tewa people, Llano weapons scientists began referencing Tewa religion in their work. Examples of romantic references to Pueblo beliefs included the naming of the Tewa reactor and the naming of critical research laboratories as kivas. Scientists went as far as building laboratories in the ruins of actual kivas and ancestral sites and exposing of toxic waste and unlined ground structures within the greater Bandelier historic site. Such ruins serve as spiritually active points of connection to Pueblo people. They went in, so most people don't know this, but there's actually there's two other parts to Bandelier that are completely closed to the public because they're so heavily irradiated, and only tribal members can visit them with a Lano escort, and you have to be completely suited up because they're that dangerous. And again, radiation knows no borders. So if you've been to Bandelier, you've likely been exposed to immense amounts of radiation. It's also disturbing that the nuclear industry in New Mexico employs the language of violent patriarchy to glorify their role in birthing the atomic bomb, birthing little boy, and New Mexico is the birthplace of the atomic bomb are two key examples, especially at a time when indigenous people and birth workers are actively reclaiming childbirth as a sacred ceremony premised on matriarchal and feminist values and beliefs. So another thing I want to mention in terms of birth work is that I was talking about how radiation can damage multiplying cells very quickly. So what this means is that if a pregnant person is exposed to radiation, that actually exposes 3 generations of people because the fetus within somebody also holds, if it's a womb haver, it also holds all the eggs it'll ever have in its lifetime. So that's actually grandparent, parent, and child. So it's 3 generations that are impacted. So there's this like very explicit tie to birth work, to birthing, to violence, violence upon the land being violence upon the body for generations. And that's why PFC takes an explicit interest in this. So when talking about the distinct way that capitalism operates in northern New Mexico, it's also crucial to discuss how it's operated historically. Santa Fe was one of the first hubs of capitalist expansion in the Western Hemisphere. And the primary industry that upheld this foreign economic system was a massive slavery network that fed the growth of settlements throughout northern New Mexico up to the 1800s. The present day art industry still exploits native artists for their craftsmanship and obviously ties the labor of the art to the people themselves, as if to buy not only an object, but to objectify the people and culture from which art and artifacts come. It is apparent why the 2 main industries that have kept northern New Mexico afloat, tourism and nuclear development, and really resource extraction in general with gas and oil, depend on the objectification and dehumanization of native people and lands. Jake Villarreal, former governor of Pewaukee, once stated that nuclear radiation contamination is just a modern version of the polio blanket. At every stage of nuclear production, sacrifices required. People, but only certain people, and their lands must be sacrificed for the security and power of others. And this is what I think, links us in the Global Imperialist Project. This links us to the indigenous people of the Marshall Islands, where some major nuclear bomb tests were held, and they were used as an experiment to see what the impact of the fallout would be. This ties us to the Congolese mine workers who worked in uranium mines to produce nuclear weapons. This ties us to the people of Hiroshima. This ties us to everybody who has been impacted by nuclearism. In the case of Los Alamos National Labs, the Manhattan Project in nuclear weapons manufacturing in northern New Mexico, Table lands, and bodies have been deemed expendable. By fabricating economic crisis and removing the ability of Native people to live sustainably off their homeland, federal policies that gave rise to nuclear development forever changed the material conditions of Pueblo people. And from here, we see a flagrant construction of Pueblo cultural imagery that is rooted in mysticism, yet romanticizes another conquest or metaphorical siphoning of spiritual power from a sacred place. Not only does Tewa identity become something novel in the process of disassociating us from our land and resources, the scientific endeavors of creating the deadliest weapons in the world do so as well. So I'm going to finish there. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you again, Justine, Mel, and Jen for sharing your knowledge on what Pueblo feminism is, the impacts of it, and I guess our role in, combating nuclear colonialism as it affects Pueblo lands, Pueblo peoples, bodies, and communities. And so we can continue to open this space up for any questions or dialogue. We have about 4 minutes left in this panel session. And yeah, we'll just open the space up if anybody has any questions. I do see one comment in the chat from Akila. It says, I'd love any recommendations the panelists have for books on the indigenous history of New Mexico, especially around the National Labs / uranium.
I'll go ahead and drop some sources that I have that I used. One of them that I'll drop in here was by Professor Rebecca Sosi. I believe she's teaching at Arizona State University right now, but she wrote a good paper on radioactive contamination in New Mexico. And then another one about uranium mining specifically and Diné people.
I have a couple. One of them is The Nuclear Borderlands, the Manhattan Project in Post-Cold War New Mexico. This is by Joseph Moscow, and I actually referenced it in the talk. Another is Understories, The Political Life of Forests in New Mexico by Kosek. And then I'm always going to recommend Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz's Roots of Resistance for comprehensive New Mexico history.
Okay, let's see. We can kind of move the conversation to, I guess, what next? How do we continue to support Pueblo peoples in, this fight against nuclear colonialism and the other issues that we have continuing in our communities? And that'll be open for all of us, all of the panelists.
I would really like to advocate for the Red Deal. The Red Deal is on the rednation.org. It's on our website. It has an anti-copyright on it, and it is divided up into 3 sections. And the occupation, heal our bodies, and heal our planet. And the Red Deal is a political platform that the Red Nation pushes. You can adopt this political platform into the work that you do. The Democratic Socialists of America have adopted it. But basically, it's the blueprint. It's the blueprints for how we're going to achieve our goals, how we're going to get this work done. And that's going to be the political platform that we at the Red Nation are operating on. And it's based off of it's kind of a response to the Green New Deal, except that it actually encompasses indigenous sovereignty and existence, really, which the Green New Deal does not. And so I recommend everybody goes to therednation.org and looks up the Red Deal, parts 1, 2, and 3. Again, it has an anti-copyright and it's free to distribute.
Just speaking from like a legal perspective, I guess, is something that's really important to advocate for is expanding tribal consultation as it currently sits under federal law, environmental law, and federal Indian law. So normally before taking sort of any environmental action, the federal government is supposed to consult with tribes. But this is really narrow and basically still upholds colonialism as it stands right now, because it only applies to federally recognized tribes, and it doesn't actually require the federal government to take sort of any action that the tribes are asking for. So in order to make this more efficient or effective for protecting Indigenous peoples, it's something that I think I like to advocate for, is expanding it towards the United Nations the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples has a formulation of consultation that is a sort of a right to deny the state's access onto their land or state use of their land without the consent of the Indigenous nation. So something that sort of looks towards providing Indigenous nations with more autonomy over their lands is going to be really important in making sure that this doesn't happen again, and also making sure that people are protected and given full information on what are the effects of these actions that the government is still like taking on a lot of our lands.
Yeah, so definitely Red Deal, read up, get involved. The Red Deal is a policy platform, but it's also an organizing tool that anyone can use in any communities to help them form the basis of any campaigns they want to organize, or if they want to start a Red Nation chapter. But also, I encourage y'all to organize in general, join an organization, join a revolutionary organization, not a nonprofit, like join a revolutionary organization. Don't get me wrong, nonprofits have their purpose, but that's what's needed right now. We need people to actively push back against these things, educate themselves and others. That's what's needed right now. And also in northern New Mexico, we're especially going to need help with that, because organizing efforts, particularly against nuclear colonialism, just get squashed time and time again. We have nonprofits that are formed under the guise that they're there to protect people and they're interested in public health, when actually the reason they exist is to crush any radical organizing and to just reinforce neoliberal narratives around environmental protection and indigeneity, and it's really awful. And not to mention, we get significant pushback from our own tribal leaders because they're dependent on it for economic development. We're dependent on contracts with the landlord for employment, or just these very, very bare minimum concessions, just peanuts really. And so having people being vocal and advocating for these things, particularly in northern New Mexico, is going to be something that is going to be needed going forward. And we're also looking to build broader networks connecting the struggles in northern New Mexico to what's happening in Acoma Laguna, to what's happening in the Navajo Nation, to what's happening with gas and oil in the Four Corners area. So yeah, and then really, again, I keep mentioning this is an internationalist issue because this is about global imperialism and reinforcing the U.S.'s place as the biggest global imperialist power. So yeah, definitely get at us. If you're interested in getting involved with Red Nation, hit us up, or any of the organizations represented here today.
Cool. And I'll also drop some more links in the chat. I have links to all parts of the Red Deal, and you can continue to check out the work that Red Nation is doing at therednation.org. And follow us on social media at the Red Nation Movement on Instagram. We're also on Facebook, and as well as some of the other freedom councils have their own Instagram pages as well. And does anybody else have one last question or comments? All right, I'll do the teacher thing and just wait 10 seconds. Okay, all right. Thank you all for joining us today. We really appreciate it, and I hope you were able to gain some knowledge today and also experience the beauty that is Pueblo women and Pueblo femmes and the fire that they put out each and every day. So thank you all, comrades and homies. And Ella, do you have anything else to add?
Nothing, just to again thank you all so much for coming through with this knowledge, with this wisdom, with this strength, and with this revolutionary fire that is so, so very needed in our movements right now. You know, we're honored to be in community with y'all, and we just really appreciate just all of the powerful work that you all have been doing, because we've all been following it from afar, you know. So thank you, Alicia, and thank you, Red Nation, Jen, Melody, Justine. We just really appreciate y'all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kudoha, for inviting us.
Yeah, thank
I
you
just
for
want to say hi, Chastity. Sorry.
Hi. Good to see you all.
Hey, Chastity.
Thank you.